A man was called Guthbrand of the Dales. He reigned over the Dales as if he were a king, though he was Herse by name. Sigvat the Skald equalled him with Erling Skjaldsson when it came to power and holdings. Sigvat quoth thus about Erling, "I knew of one other warrior like you. He was called Guthbrand. The protector of men ruled lands widely. I declare you are both thought equal, lord. He who considers himself better is lying to himself." Guthbrand had a son who will be mentioned here. When Guthbrand received tidings that King Olaf had arrived at Lower and forced people to convert to Christendom, he sent out a call to arms and summoned all men in the Dales to an assembly with him at the farm called Hunthorpe. All came, a great multitude, for nearby lies the river that is called Logu, and people could travel to the assembly as easily by ship as on land. Guthbrand held an assembly with them and said a man called Ólafs had come to Logu, and he wants to command us to accept another faith than that which we've had before, and break all our gods asunder. He claims that he has a much stronger and mightier god. It is a wonder that the earth doesn't burst asunder beneath him, and that our gods tolerate his actions when he dares speak like that. I expect that if we carry out Thor, who has always aided us, out of the temple in which he stands on this estate, and he sees Olaf and his men, then Olaf's god will melt away along with Olaf and his men, and vanish. Then they all roared and said that Olaf would never escape if he came to meet them, and he will not dare to venture further south into the Dales, they said. Then they selected 700 men to go north to scout at Breitha. Guthbrand's son, 18 winters old, was the chieftain of that band. He was followed by many other outstanding men. They arrived at the farm called Hof, and spent 3 nights there. They were joined by many people who had fled from Leisha, Lum, and Walgar, who would not convert to Christendom. King Olaf and Bishop Sigurd appointed priests to stay in Lom and Walgar. Then they travelled over Wauher Raust, and came down into the valley at Sill, where they stayed for the night, and received tidings that a great army lay before them. The farmers on Breitha also learned this, and prepared to fight against the king. When the king rose in the morning, he put on his armour and travelled south over the plains at Sill, and did not halt before he came to Breitha, where he saw a great army before him, prepared for battle. The king arranged his army and rode ahead of it himself. He spoke to the farmers and commanded them to convert to Christendom. They answered, "You might get something else to do today besides mocking us." They then roared their war cries and beat their shields with their weapons. The king's men leapt forth and threw their spears, and the peasants turned and fled at once, so that few men remained. Guthbrand's son was captured. King Olaf spared him and brought him along with him. The king stayed 4 nights there. Then the king spoke to Guthbrand's son, "Go back home to your father now, and tell him that I will arrive shortly." He then returned home and told his father the ill tidings, that they had encountered the king and fought against him. "But our whole army fled at once, and I was captured," he said. "The king spared me, and bade me go tell you that he will soon be here. And now we have an army of no more than 200 men out of the whole host that we had raised against him. I advise you now, father, not to fight against this man." "It can be heard," said Guthbrand, "that all courage has been beaten out of you. You left home with ill fortunes, and long will your expedition be remembered. And now you at once believe in the delusion that that man is bringing, he who have disgraced you and your followers." The following night, Guthbrand dreamt that a shining man came to him. Great terror radiated from him, and he spoke to Guthbrand. "Your son did not lead a victorious strike against King Olaf. Yours will be even less so if you intend to do battle against the king. You and your whole army will perish. Wargs will tear you and all your followers apart. Ravens will shred you." This dreadful threat greatly scared Guthbrand, and he told it to Thord Fatbelly, who was chieftain of the Dales. He answered, "The same vision came to me." In the morning they signalled for an assembly, and said that it seemed advisable to them that they should meet with the man who came from the north with new teachings, and find out if he spoke the truth. Then Guthbrand spoke to his son. You must now go to meet the king who spared you. 12 men shall follow you." And this was done. They sought out the king and told him their errand, that the free men would hold an assembly with him and make a truce between them and the king. The king was content with this, and both parties bound themselves to this by special agreement for as long as their meeting would last. And after this was settled, they then returned and told Guthbrand and Thord that a truce had been made. The king then went to the farm called Lithstath, and remained there for 5 nights. Then the king went out to meet the farmers and hold the assembly with them. A heavy rain fell on that day. When the proceedings had commenced, the king stood up and said that Leisha, Loom, and Wargar had converted to Christendom, torn down their bloat houses, and now believed in the true God who had created heaven and earth and knew all things. Thereupon the king sat down, and Guthbrand replied, "We don't know who you are talking about. You call someone God whom neither you nor anyone else can see, but we have the God who can be seen every day. But he is not out today, for it is raining. He will appear mighty and terrifying to you, and I expect you to be struck with fear when he arrives at the assembly. But since you claim that your God is so great, then let him make it so that the weather tomorrow is cloudy but without rain. Then let us meet here." The king returned home to his lodging. He brought Guthbrand's son with him as a hostage, and gave them another man in exchange. In the evening the king asked Guthbrand's son how their god was fashioned. He replied that he was shaped after Thor, and held a hammer in his hand, and was great of stature. He was hollow within, and beneath him was something akin to a stand, which he stood upon when he was out. His figure lacked neither gold or silver. Every day he was brought 4 loaves of bread and meat as well. Then they went to bed. The king watched all night in prayer. At dawn the king went to mass, and next to his meal, and then to the assembly. The weather was such as Guthbrand had asked for. Now the bishop stood up in his robes. He had a mitre on his head and a crosier in his hands. He preached to the farmers and told them of the many miracles that God had worked, and concluded his speech well. Then Thord Fatbelly replied, "He talks a lot, that horned one, holding the staff crooked at the top like a ram's horn in his hand. But since you fellows claim that your God works so many wonders, then tell him tomorrow before sunrise to make the day be clear and full of sunshine. Let us then meet again and do one of 2 things. Either reach a settlement about this issue, or go to war." And then they went their separate ways. There was a man with King Ólaf called Kolbein the Strong. He came from a family in the fjords. He was always armed in this way, that he was girt with a sword, and carried a great cudgel in his hands, that some men call a club. The king told Kolbein that he should stand next to him in the morning. Then he told his men, "Go down to where the ships of the farmers lie tonight, and drill holes in them all, and set their horses loose from the farms where they are kept." All this was done. The king spent the night in prayer, beseeching God to release him from his difficult task through his mildness and mercy. When the mass ended and morning approached, the king went to the assembly. When he arrived, some of the farmers were already present. Then they saw a large crowd of farmers approaching the assembly, carrying a great idol covered with gold and silver among them. When the farmers who were already at the assembly saw this, they all leapt up and bowed down before the monstrosity. Thereupon it was set down in the middle of the plain of the assembly. The farmers sat on one side, while the king and his men sat on the other. Then Guthbrand of the Dales stood up and said, "Where is your God now, king? I think he will carry the beard on his chin rather low now. And now it seems to me that the bragging of you and the horned one sitting beside you, whom you call bishop, has diminished since yesterday. For now our God who rules over all has come, and looks upon you with piercing eyes. I see now that you are terrified and scarcely dare raise your eyes. Now cast away your superstition, and believe in our God, who holds your fate in his hands." With this he concluded his speech. The king spoke quietly to Kolbein the Strong in such a way that the farmers did not notice. If it happens during my speech that they look away from their god, then strike him as hard as you can with your club." Then the king rose and spoke. "Much have you spoken to us this morning. You wonder why you cannot see our God, but we expect that he will soon come to us. You try to frighten us with your God, who is blind and deaf, and can neither help himself nor others. He can't even move from where he is standing unless he is carried. But now I expect that he will soon come to harm. Now look up and gaze to the east. There our God comes in great light." Then the sun rose, and all the farmers looked toward the sun. At that moment Kolbane struck their god so that it burst all asunder, and out of it ran mice as big as cats, as well as lizards and serpents. The farmers were so frightened that they fled. Some ran to their ships, but when they launched them, water ran in and filled them up, preventing them from boarding. Those who ran to their horses did not find them. Afterwards the king ordered the farmers to be called together and said that he would speak with them. The farmers returned, and the assembly commenced. Then the king stood up and spoke. "I don't know," he said, "why you are making such noise and running around. Now you can see how mighty your God was, the one to whom you offered gold and silver, food and provisions. Behold now what creatures drew benefit from it. Mice and serpents, lizards and toads. It is worst for those who believe in such things and will not abandon their follies. Take your gold and jewelry that now lie on the ground and bring it home to your women, and never again hang it on stocks or stones. There are now two options between us to choose from. Either convert to Christendom or do battle with me today. Victory will belong to those granted it by the God we believe in." Then Guthbrand of the Dales stood up and spoke. "We have suffered a great injury upon our God. But since he could not help us, we will now believe in the God that you believe in." And they all converted to Christendom. The bishop baptized Guthbrand and his son. King Ólaf and Bishop Sigurd appointed priests to remain there. Guthbrand built a church in the Dales, and those who were foes before parted as friends. Thus ends the saga of Guthbrand of the Dales.